Welcome all, and welcome to Designing Agendas for Equity webinar. My name is Mark Salinas. I'm here with my colleague, Colin Davis. We are deeply humbled that you would take some time out of your day, several hundred of you, to engage in some reflection and thinking about designing agendas for equity work. We want to start by saying this, that in this webinar, we hope that you will bring forward the things that really kind of matter to you when it comes to thinking about really what matters to you. And so I want to just take a minute to, for Colin and I to introduce ourselves. I started here at the National Equity Project in 2002, and I'm on year 16. And prior to that, I spent time teaching middle and high school. And since then, over a decade, my work has been around supporting individuals and teams to really align their leadership intentions with their actions around equity work and what that means to them. Colin?
Hi all, glad to be here. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, my name is Colin Davis, and I've been with the National Equity Project since 2004. Lucky enough to work with this man, my friend Mark Salinas, since then. And we work as coaches and leadership coaches and facilitators of groups, supporting people to address what's most important in terms of the equity challenge that they face in their organizations or districts or communities. And so we work kind of shoulder to shoulder with people to address those issues, as well as offering a variety of services through the Center for Equity Leadership, which Mark and I co-lead. And that's a place where people can kind of come to us for professional development, webinars. We have a Leading for Equity fellowship program, as well as some other networking and collaboration events, really all in service of creating stronger networks of equity-focused leaders across sectors. So we're glad to be here. A lot of what we do is actually supporting people to create experiences where groups of people, designing agendas where groups of people can dig into equity work more meaningfully. So we're hoping today will be valuable for you.
So we're going to just share a quick word about our organization. We are a leadership development organization, and we're not neutral when it comes to what we're up to. And if you look at our mission statement, it really is centered around transforming educational experiences and outcomes for young people, families, and communities. And we do this through partnering and coaching individuals. And we are based here in Oakland, California, our headquarters, but we do also have an office in Denver and Chicago area. So we do work in at least 10, 12 states. But we're happy to be broadcasting here from sunny Oakland. And wherever you are, we hope that it's been a beautiful day and morning for you as well. So I want to just give a little bit of the flow of the webinar for our just under 1 hour. And it's in a couple different chunks. We're going to take a minute to get present and give you a minute to think about what's been catching your attention lately, so we can bring our full selves to this webinar. And as we think about equity and the work we're doing as connected to that, we want to spend a little bit of time just offering you a couple notions and perspectives on equity. So we're going to invite you to bring your views and perspectives of what it means to do equity in your context, given your role. And lastly, we want to share kind of a framework and approach we use to designing spaces for collaboration around equity-centered work. And so we'll spend a bulk of our time in that domain. And we hope that it will be interactive, that will be reflective for you, and you can have some practical applications. So pull out a few Post-its, anything you like to jot down on a notepad. We're going to do a poll or two to kind of just see what's on the hearts and minds of several of you all around a couple ideas that we put forward. Give a couple opportunities to do some chatting, and then toward the end of the webinar, opportunity to surface a few questions, and we'll give a few responses, and that will be how we'll kind of close out the hour. Lastly and finally, I want to say that we will send you post-webinar a PDF of the slides. So as you are following along and interacting, don't feel you have to write down everything for those that take those copious notes. So if that helps you process, please do, and do know that you will get all the slides. So kind of sit back and just kind of take it all in.
quick jump in also, you will be getting a transcript of the chat. So we have opportunities for that. You'll be getting that and some other resources. So more to come. Enjoy that.
So by way of modeling, we always like to give opportunities for people to get present in any gathering, even though we're virtual, that we're in. And so first is to give you an opportunity to pay attention to what's on your heart and mind. And we want to do that by showing you just a few images over probably the last 6 to 8 months. And as you look at those images, just be paying attention to what's going on for you. We're going to give you a moment just after a couple of these images to jot down a few things that kind of came up for you. So I'm going to start with a couple images. So I want to invite you to take 2 deep breaths and pull out a Post-it or piece of paper that's near you and jot down, just take 30 seconds to jot down a few thoughts and feelings as you saw some of those images and been thinking about what's been on your heart and mind lately. Thank you. And so, again, to be fully transparent, we feel that it's always important for people to bring their full selves in, and the things that are happening, social, political context, whether or not it's national, state, local, right in your community, or right outside your building, it's important to not suppress that and to bring that in to give you the juice around what matters to you. And oftentimes, the equity work we do is so connected to social justices and things we see that are happening right now on the news and playing out right in front of us. So thank you for taking a little time to just bring your full self. Your heart might be racing a little bit faster and you might be feeling like, whew, right? but let's normalize that, right? This work around equity is not just a cognitive conversation. And even though we'll give you some practical tools to start some conversations and to be in dialogue differently, it's to bring our full selves, our heart, our passions, our emotions into the space. So the next, just before we kind of get into a little bit of the framework and designing meetings, we think it's important to just take a minute to offer that when doing any kind of planning toward equity, it's important to continue to, what are you holding around what equity means to you? So your views and perspectives matter. And it's really important that the groups that you're with as well are having space to unpack that and to make sure that's present. So when you're designing with a what in mind, and you continue to have some shared understanding of what equity means in our context of how the work we are planning and doing, how it's connecting to that. So we want to share with you kind of our working definition and a little bit what it involves, not to sell it to you and say this is what equity should mean, but for us as an organization, this is what we kind of put forward when we're partnering with people in terms of our stances, the moves we make. It's in service of having conversations like this. And so first, we would say at its core, it's about every learner receiving what they need to develop to their full potential, academically and socially. And underneath that, really, it's about so that people can thrive. And then working towards equity would involve things such as trying to work to understand and remove predictability. The predictability that often is correlated with success or failure in a context that it can point to a race, ethnicity, a language. And so when systems are having conversations to really understand some of the, and even if it's unintentional, which oftentimes it is, no one is planning for predictable outcomes that have inequities, but it's really understanding what is contributing to the predictability that's happening in our system, and can we have the real conversation understanding the root causes. And so working toward that is trying to understand why some of the things are happening, and it's multiple reasons oftentimes. We would also say it's about leadership and stances that are saying that we also have to interrupt some things, right? We have to look at some of the practices, policies, things that are in place, or some of our own biases that are getting in the way. And it's in service of creating something different, new, really an inclusive environment, a sense of belonging for all individuals. If you're in a school setting, that means an inclusive environment for not only just the young people, but the adults that are working there, and the families and the communities that are surrounding and holding their hands around that environment. So it's inclusivity for all. And lastly, we would say it involves kind of discovering and culling and cultivating the unique gifts, talents that every human possesses. So we really feel it's an asset approach and stance around equity that we think also helps to humanize the work when we're starting from a place of you matter, you have something to give, you have something to offer. And so how do I tap into that and support spaces that unleash the power and potential in people, in places and spaces where I'm designing a space for that. So we offered you just a couple notions to consider, again, not to sell. But as I kind of walk through these four, we're going to launch a poll and ask you to click on one that, you know, either resonates or kind of speaks closely to something, a view that you hold around equity. So here comes the poll, and we're going to kind of start to share with you how it starts to emerge around what you are feeling. So the interrupting inequitable practices, examining biases, and creating inclusive environments is getting some early and quick hits.
As Mark said, we offer this not because there's one right answer, but just to kind of get a sense of what's standing out to people in this moment, knowing that there's probably overlap for some of you. Look at that.
Fantastic. We have at least half of you now on, and it looks like the one in the middle, and not that that's your favorite one, but in there, if your work involves that, so whatever your role is in your context, we always invite people to continue to think about what it looks like to do that from your role. What does it look like to interrupt? And interrupt doesn't necessarily mean you are like causing, you're interrupting people. It's actually how do you sometimes put a little pause on some things to really understand the impact that it's actually having. Sometimes we interrupt things and we may not even know what we're going to replace it with, but we actually still have to be bold and courageous to say, you need to put a stop in there and to understand how this is playing out. And, all right. So thank you for that.
Share those results.
And the last piece I want to offer is that as oftentimes we hear people talking about equitable outcomes in their context, we just want to continue to invite people to think about equity work as an outcome and as a process. That the dynamics that are playing out in the larger social political context, like even when you look at some of the images that I showed you, that people, even with the best of intentions of what they're up to as an organization or as a group, sometimes don't always behave in those ways as they're working on that work unconsciously. And so how do we continue to understand that we have to kind of be, sounds a little cheesy, excuse me, but it is, how do we be what we're up to, right? How do we act in those ways of what we're supporting around our vision of what it would actually look like when it's all said and done around equity? And so lastly, that we feel it's a real, it can be a real liberating process. And so again, underneath that is a belief that if you can kind of unleash the power and potential of people, you're starting to create those ripples of what you're up to together. And so everyone's working in the same direction. So with that,
Thank you. We wanted to make sure we at least had some moment to touch on how you're thinking about equity, offer a little bit about how we think about it. As we turn into some of the approaches, frameworks, and tools we use to actually design experiences for people to work on equity together. So to do that, we want to encourage each of you to bring to mind a group of people that you work with. We are assuming that you signed on to something called Designing Meetings for Equity because either you are going to be designing agendas, or you currently do that, or you want to think about how you would. And we think it's most helpful to do that in relation to a specific group or team. So that might be your staff, a department, a group that you facilitate regularly, or just a group that you're a part of that meets together to work on something together. And we want you to bring those people to mind, thinking about what do we do when we come together. So take a moment just to bring to mind one group that you work with or you want to hold in your mind as we go through designing meetings for equity together. As you think of those individual people and the purpose of that group, I want to give you a chance to actually jot down a couple thoughts about what do you want to see this group doing together if they were really focusing explicitly and powerfully on equity. What would it look like? What would it sound like? What would people be working on together? What would they be talking about? What kind of questions would they ask? How would they be interacting with one another? No right or wrong answer here, really just about generating some vision for down the road, what might it look like from your perspective if this group of people really started to engage meaningfully in equity work that mattered. So take just 30 seconds or so, think to yourself, jot down a couple of ideas about that vision, if you will. So holding those people in mind and holding a little bit of that vision of where you think you might want to go or ultimately you're hoping to see, we want to start to actually get into the concrete work of how do we sit down and design an agenda to get this group to start making their way on the path to that vision that you just imagined. So the question is, where do we start? And for us, one of the biggest places to start is actually knowing those people. Part of the reason we ask you to bring that group of people to mind is that in order to design an effective meeting for equity, we have to be responsive to the particular individuals, needs, strengths, dynamics of that group of folks. So we want to be thinking of those folks very clearly in mind and getting a sense of where they're at. And then we want to think about, I might have a long-term vision about where they want to go, but at the end of this meeting, what do we want them to walk away with? So really we want to start with outcomes. we draw from the work of Steve Zweiback, who offers that there are two important different kinds of outcomes that we need to plan toward. One of them is practical outcomes. That's the thing that's most commonly used in agendas. Usually at the top of agenda, the things you can say, yes, we're going to get that done, walk away having accomplished X, Y, or Z. Very important, but not necessarily sufficient, especially when we're thinking about meaningful equity work. The other outcome we want to get really explicit about, even before we design an agenda, is what do we want people to experience? This is a real game changer. It has been from my own experience in designing agendas and supporting others to get people to come together and collaborate on meaningful equity work, starting with what do we need them to feel and experience in order to really make progress in an authentic way, a powerful way on the equity work they want to do together. So we're going to explore both practical and experiential, and we want to put forward that it's very important to get clear about both to create the agenda design that's really going to have new opportunities for meaningful collaboration. So to start with practical, we want to offer just a few examples. These are really just put forward as examples, not exemplars, not so the best kind, but just to give you a sense of what that might look like. For some groups, you might be thinking about this group of teachers or this group of social workers, whoever we may be, wants to learn a new strategy. Actually, in this meeting or in this couple of meetings, we're going to learn a strategy to use with our students or our clients and actually have some time to practice applying it. A different kind of practical outcome might be this group needs to get clear about and actually agree on what our goals are for the year. So we come together every week or every 2 weeks or whatever it is, and we want to make sure everyone is clear about what are we going to prioritize and make sure that we accomplish collectively and actually get some agreement about that. As we're moving more toward equity-focused work, we might actually say in this meeting or this couple of meetings, we're going to start to identify what are the equity challenges that we see in our context, the specific inequities we want to address, and how might we prioritize those? So identify and prioritize what are the specific challenges we are going to keep working on together. This last one is an example that's a little bit of a different kind of outcome, but it is still what we would consider a practical outcome. And that's really about the shared understanding that people need to have to be able to deepen their equity work. So one outcome here, as an example, might be this team needs to build some shared language to have some way of actually understanding each other more clearly when we're talking about equity and specifically about systemic oppression and how it plays out. We offer this example is because often in our work, people come to equity work with very different ideas about what that means. Some people are talking about individual prejudice or discrimination, and we want to actually have a collective understanding of a larger system of oppression that we are actually all affected by and working in to be able to have more meaningful and actually powerful work that we can do together. So again, these are just examples, but all of these you could say, yes, after this meeting or two, people are sharing some language, or yes, we actually agreed on those goals or identified those challenges. For any of those practical outcomes, we want to encourage you to avoid the trap of listing topics. And I know from my own experience, when I first started agenda design, I would just write down a few things we all need to talk about or do something about. But what we would want to really encourage is how to intentionally choose the verbs. So are we coming together in this meeting to actually clarify something? Do we want to make sure everyone walks away with a clearer idea about this policy or this incident? Are we actually coming together to generate a bunch of ideas? Is this a meeting where we're actually trying to brainstorm and open up new possibilities? Or is this a meeting where we're actually trying to make a decision? All of those things are going to lead to very different kinds of activities. And it's important to think about what explicitly do we want to do in terms of agenda design and also when we're communicating with participants so we are on the same page about exactly what we're up to. So that is a little bit about the practical outcomes. These, again, are what people tend to use more frequently. We would say these are absolutely essential and also not sufficient, especially when working on equity collaboration. So part of the reason for that connects to this quote that we love from Maya Angelou. She offered that, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And well, when I hear this quote, I think of it more in terms of that one-on-one, how an individual might make me feel in an interaction. There's a level of this that's true even in groups as well. I mean, actually even when we think about the meetings that we run, that people will actually walk away from a meeting not necessarily totally clear about exactly what was said, or maybe not remembering exactly what did we land on for that policy, but they will remember that felt really productive, or I didn't feel heard in that meeting, or I felt like we actually engaged in some meaningful discourse and discussion, right? There was a sense of it, an experience of it people are gonna hold on to, often even more than the specifics of the practical outcomes. So that's why we wanna make sure we get really clear about what's the experience this particular group most needs to have in order to move their work forward together. So here again are just a few examples. One experiential outcome might just be, this group needs to strengthen their trust, needs to build some trust among members of the team. Maybe people are not engaging very much together, a little bit withholding. Part of that is your sense that they need to actually build relational trust together. Another experiential outcome might be each group members has opportunities to express themselves and also has heard multiple perspectives on the challenge we're addressing. So maybe you know that actually it's not just about getting clear about what we're going to do about this equity challenge, but each person saying something about why that matters to them and feeling heard, and also hearing different people's perspectives as a way of coming together as a stronger team. Some teams just simply need, I need a sense of productivity. I need to feel like we're getting somewhere, accomplishment, momentum. If that's my experiential outcome, I'm gonna plan a different kind of a set of activities to make sure that they experience that. And finally, maybe your practical goal was my practical outcome was agreeing on goals, but the experiential might be, what would it take to actually build some sense of collective ownership? Not just, yes, we agreed on that, but I feel invested in that. Each member of this team feels like these are important, and I see my own connection to it, and I want to make sure we are focusing on that together. So that, again, is going to lead to a set of different activities or prompts to be able to build that ownership. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, these are just some 4 examples. We're going to ask you in a moment to start to think of your own. Before we do, we want to be clear that for both experiential and practical outcomes, we really want to encourage you and continue to encourage ourselves to prioritize. One of the biggest traps is packing way too much into an agenda. People don't necessarily get where they need to go and end up feeling frustrated just because they were trying to do too much in a short time. And then they leave with that feeling, that experience that they think, oh, I don't want to go back there. That's not so productive. So how do we actually prioritize? If nothing else happens, here's the one thing I want to make sure this team accomplishes or leaves getting clear on. If nothing else happens, here's the experience I want to make sure people are starting to feel on this team. So with that, we want to invite you to try it out. Just to yourself, think of an upcoming meeting, or think of this group kind of next time they meet, what might be one practical outcome you'd hope that they'd accomplish, and one experiential outcome, especially with this idea of moving them along the path of becoming more explicitly focused on equity and collaborating in meaningful ways about equity. But wherever they are, think about one practical outcome that you might hope that they would accomplish, one experiential. I'll give you a minute just to jot that down. All right, now, as we said, the practical outcomes tend to be more commonly used, commonly understood. So what we'd like to do now is actually hear from you and focus on your initial thoughts about that experiential outcome. Since that tends to be a little bit newer for folks, we want to just kind of collect a bunch of ideas. No right or wrong answer here, but just what are you thinking right now about, for the team you're thinking about, what would you hope they experienced in this next upcoming meeting? So to do that, we're going to ask you to chat, and you'll see that chat icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. When you open the chat, you want to make sure that you're chatting to all panelists and attendees. That's going to make sure everybody who's on here gets to see your brilliance, and not just Mark and myself. So you're going to start chatting. We want to invite you to start doing that. On the right side of the screen, you'll see Mark and I just got some initial ideas started about what else this might look like. But take it where you want to go, and let's start to see what kind of experiential outcomes do you have in mind for this team. Let's see what we got. Want to experience them to experience a feeling of agency and mutual support that we can get through this. Love that. Want to hear people's personal experiences of others with racism, white privilege, systemic oppression. Another one offers, I want them to create a sense of belonging. Beautiful. Ownership and pride of the development of a process. What are we working on together? And actually, do people feel ownership and pride of that? That's great. Human connection despite work roles. Appreciate that. That hierarchy that exists in our organization sometimes can get in the way of just connecting as humans and honoring every contribution. Thank you for that. Building trust with leadership and the rest of the team. Another great one, honoring different opinions and feel comfortable sharing varied perspectives. Very often in teams, people think we have to just all be on the same page at all times, and actually giving space for that dissent and different opinions. Really essential, we would offer for equity-focused work. These are fantastic. Thank you all for bringing these. We're going to get a copy again of the transcript of the chat, so you'll be able to check back on these and maybe borrow a couple to see if some of them might work for you. The experience of how diverse perspective leads through conflict to new learning and possibilities. Really appreciate that. A lot of our work often is trying to help people acknowledge and normalize conflict as an important part of any team really coming together, especially as they're trying to work on equity together. Great. So thank you for all that. Really great examples there. Seems like y'all are on it. So again, you'll be getting a copy of that so you can refer back to some of those. And we want to keep those in mind as we start to think about, now we got some outcomes in mind, both practical and experiential. And then how do we design the experience? So it's really essential that you all are clear, just as you're showing us about, I want to make sure people are experiencing these things, make sure we get this practical outcome accomplished, but then how do we sit down and actually design that? And we would offer that the way we approach this wants to start with actually your own experience. So we're not going to necessarily chat this right now, but we want to ask you to pause for a moment and think about just from your own experience. What meeting, convening that was equity focused have you been a part of that felt really successful, important? Bring to mind that equity focused meeting that went well. And just for a moment to think about what was built into the design that supported that success. It's one thing to have amazing speakers or certain things happen that were really important, but I want to give you a chance just to reflect on when something went really well, what was built into the design that supported that success? Just take a moment for yourself, if you would, and bring that to mind. All right. We're going to offer you in just a moment a framework that we use all the time that was created by John Heron, that is about how we design an experience that attends to the whole person. And we want to offer that we do that by changing the structure of the agenda and changing the structure of the experience. Steve Zweiback offers this great quote that experience has a structure. When you change the structure, you change the experience. So currently, if you're with a team that is feeling demoralized, feeling like this isn't very helpful, this isn't productive, there's some structures that are in place, everything from how the room is set up to where you are, to the structures of the activities and the flow of the agenda that actually support that current reality. And we want to offer you some ideas about how you might shift the structure of the agenda that ultimately will change people's experience, ideally moving them toward that experiential outcome that you named. So we're going to dig into the experiential learning cycle by John Heron. Again, this is something we use all the time in our own work, as well as supporting clients who are trying to work with their own teams. And the idea is designing meetings that are attending to the entirety of a person. And John Heron talks about 4 different forms of learning that we need to attend to when we're attending to the whole person: affective, imaginal, conceptual, and practical. These are kind of 4 domains we want to attend to as we're starting to design an agenda to create people's full engagement in equity-focused work. So he offers this as a cycle. And you'll see here some of the general idea about what each of these domains represents. But the cycle here, often, if not always, from our perspective, starts in the domain that's called affective. And we're going to talk about that in just a second, but it starts with affective, moves to imaginal, and then conceptual, and then practical. So let's dig into that and kind of see what that might look like. And you're going to get a chance to start to think about what that might mean for you. So beginning with the affective domain of learning, this is the emotions and feelings of learning. In that kind of yellowish orange text there, you'll see a few examples of what people might be doing to connect to the affective. Ultimately, this is the domain where people are getting in touch with how they feel and getting in touch, kind of connecting with one another. It's a way of kind of bringing the full self in. And we would offer that this is good practice for any type of meeting, but especially any conversation about equity has to begin here. People are coming into equity-focused conversations with a whole wide range of experiences, lived experiences, understandings, etc., and often a lot of different kinds of emotions, strong emotions. And we want to make sure that when we engage people in this work, we're starting by connecting to people about what they really care about, including what they're concerned about, what they fear, but also what they're passionate about, as well as connecting to one another as humans. So that's the affective realm, the active domain. Start there, open people up, and then move them into what John Heron calls the imaginal. I was not convinced that that was a word. We did look it up at some point, and it seems like other people use that word, so we're going to go with it. But the idea is that this is about learning that involves intuition, imagery, connects to creative, less linear thinking. So this is, again, you'll see in the yellow-orange text there a few ideas of how to connect to images, but even also just hopes, dreams, possibilities. Videos often is a place of really getting in touch with what's another possibility that is outside of where I am right now. Where it's less about you have to learn this concept or do this thing, but more just opening up to creative possibilities. And we would say this is really particularly important where we're engaging people in what can be very challenging and sometimes disheartening equity work, that there's some experience we're providing, an opportunity for people to open up to some inspiration, to some new possibility, to spark their own agency, to be able to engage more fully in this equity work. And so the affective and imaginal together, as you see those on the cycle, those 2 domains, you'll notice that there's no right or wrong answer there. Anyone can connect in any way. There's an access that just brings anyone in. There's no prior knowledge or correct answer that they have to perform. It's really about connecting people to themselves, to each other, and to new possibilities before we dig into the kind of information and conceptual or practical work. All right, so now we got this group and they're totally opened up is what happens, you see. So once we've done some of that work, we can go into the learning of new content or concepts. This might be a text-based protocol. This might be data that we're looking at. This might be new strategies that we're trying to learn, but some kind of new information that we want everyone to engage with. And ultimately, when we're thinking about designing agendas for equity, we're talking about the conceptual knowledge that people need and the understanding that they need collectively that's essential for equity work. So it actually is one of the experiential outcomes one of you named in the chat is I want people to be clearer about how privilege plays out, white privilege or elements of oppression. So those kind of things are the kind of things that are one example of how we might need to get some shared learning in this area to be able to do more powerful work together. All right, the final domain is where all of that comes together to what are we going to do about it? And how do we actually apply things? So this is practical domain. It's about learning how to do something, applying new skills. So maybe we just learned a strategy and we're going to do a little role play about it. Or maybe we've talked through a bunch of possibilities, looked at some data, And now we want to start to apply our understanding to beginning an action plan or a lesson plan, whatever it might be. And ultimately, this is essential that we have some place where equity-based collaboration is not just about personal experience, although it has to start there, but about how do we actually create change, making sure that it doesn't just stay in the conceptual realm, but actually goes to how are we taking action to make individual and collective progress toward equity outcomes. So that is the general cycle. Hopefully that makes some sense. We want to offer today's design of this webinar because we did use it as we were actually putting this webinar together. So what Mark led you through with those images from the news about what's on your heart and mind these days, what's getting to you, is one way it's actually both a little bit of an imaginal of kind of seeing some images that provoke some experience, but the primary purpose there was to connect to what do you really care about? What's affecting you these days? Connecting to your emotion. The imaginal, very brief, but when I started to ask you to bring a group to mind and just visualize down the road, what would it look like for them to be engaging in equity work really fully and powerfully? What are your hopes? That visualization is one example of a short imaginal activity. And then the conceptual is what we've been going through just this little bit about different types of practical and experiential meeting outcomes, understanding this conceptual framework of the experiential learning cycle. And then the practical is when we give you a chance to actually try one out, write down practical and experiential outcomes. When we have a longer full day institute, we actually have people sketch out a basic agenda using this experiential learning cycle framework to just try it on, the practical element there. All right, so hopefully you're getting a sense of what that looks like. And we want to give you a chance to reflect on your own practice. So as you think about the agendas that you're designing, and again, if you're new to designing agendas, maybe you think about the agendas that you're experiencing in the meetings you're in. But if you are someone who creates agendas, designs agendas, which of these domains do you tend to focus on most, especially when thinking about equity-focused meetings? Again, no blame or judgment here. There's no right answer, but just an awareness of where do you tend to focus your attention when designing those experiences. We're going to give you a chance to have a little poll, see where your current practice tends to be. So you should see a poll on your screen now, and we'll just give people a chance to say which of these tends to be where you spend the most time, focus on most.
Love to see the hits on the affective.
Yep. We've got about 20% right now on the affective. Shout out to the one person who's like, I got an imaginal, I do that. That is definitely for myself. I know the part of my practice that has had to stretch the most. Never had to learn that before. A lot of people, it's like about almost half of you focus on the conceptual, and then about 32% on the practical. But the numbers are shifting, but generally speaking, this is what we often see with clients as well. The conceptual and practical tend to be where people focus and live in their agendas. And again, those are essential pieces, but we want to encourage you to explore what it might mean to invest more in the affective and imaginal as a way of pulling people in and opening people up to engage more fully in the other parts of the agenda.
And if I could say one thing in particular around the imaginal, because that's also just been a learning growth area for me over years of doing this work, I found that it's a really key move to help people like kind of not be so constrained and really see and open up new possibilities, because doing this work can sometimes feel like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know what this really looks like. I don't know if this can get done, but actually liberating oneself to say, what could it possibly look like and sound like when done? What would it feel like? And so it kind of unearths the possibilities for folks, which then becomes very motivating. And even though you still might be like, there's still a gap between that, that vision and our reality, but it continues to put back in my consciousness my belief in what's possible. And again, imaginal activities are really, really awesome. It helps lead people to some more agency around taking action. Just want to make a plug for that.
Thank you. And again, we want to say that it really is about the balance of all four and
Yes.
knowing your team to figure out how much of our time together is going to be focused on what. So we actually want to do one last poll for you, which is to ask, given what your tendency is, what's an area you want to strengthen more in your agenda design? And want to say that we just gave a plug for the Affective and Imaginal, and sometimes there's some teams that are doing a lot of kind of more personal connections, which is really important, but there's less of the shared understanding of what it is that we're sitting in a social political context, the less of the conceptual kind of shared knowledge, or we stay all in that knowledge place and don't get to the what are we doing about it or how do we apply this. So again, there's value in all four. Just want to give you a moment to focus on what you might want to strengthen in your own agenda design, focus on.
Mhm.
And it looks like Imaginal is at 44%, 45, it's going up there. And then Affective is around 36% right now. Great. And we do still have a smaller number of around 10% for conceptual or practical. And again, we want to be very clear. It's important to make sure we're finding ways to attend to all four in some way, in a way that works for the group that we're working with, to be able to really create the balanced experience that we want people to have. But thank you for sharing that, just to hopefully helpful to just have a little intention and get a sense of what other folks are working on as well. All right, so that's where we landed.
Fantastic.
And at this point, we want to make sure we have some time for your questions.
Fantastic. So if you can write down a couple of questions that you have that we can maybe field and kind of give some responses to things that may have been coming up for you as we've been engaging. So we'll do that in the chat.
You could do that. Yeah, there's a Q&A icon, but I think chat probably works just as well, so we get a sense of what people are doing. Jason's asking specific examples of how to build a sense of collective ownership during meetings. It's a great question. You want to start with that, or you want me to?
Yeah, well, the first thing comes to me, like even, stepping back even from the experiential learning cycle, partly the thinking about how the team is getting clear about what they're up to and how they are working together. So I think about community agreements, about how we want to be in relationship. And another level of that is even some conversation around how do we see ourselves collectively owning this work, and really specifically talk about what that looks like in practice. Is one thing to think about. I even stepping back from the experiential learning cycle. And again, I think for me, the important domain is the imaginal, because people talk their way into what's possible. Again, you put things out into the universe around what you care about, what you see, and you see what's possible. It then sets up an on-ramp for you to start to say, and I actually should be working on that. And you hear other folks too, and where you hear and see some synergy that comes out when you're kind of not only just doing that individually, but you're doing that collectively.
Just to tag on to that, one of the biggest shifts that we often work with leaders on is how to move from a leader who's kind of guiding people about what we're doing to actually listening to people about what do you care about, and how does what we're doing connect to why you get up and come to work every day. What pieces of this feel particularly important to you? What can you contribute to that? So that it's really giving the kind of power back to the people who are implementing whatever that is, and getting them a sense of like, yeah, this is why this is important, and to give room for dissent about what's challenging about this, where are the conflicts, to be able to talk through and work through some of that. So there's some examples there. We've got a question about best practices when conversations get emotional. That is a great question, and a big question, especially as facilitators of equity work. You want to start with that?
Yeah, well, the first thing when I see that is actually doing equity work, you actually want it to be emotional.
Yep.
So actually this is where, right? And so you want to actually bring the full self and all of the range of emotions. So from the passions, the excitement emotions, and the times when actually people are feeling some doubt and some frustration. And so giving some space, not like therapy sessions, but people to tend to their I guess, their frustrations and their anger and their disappointment, but to really work through, so what's going on for me and what might I need? And so having a space for people to actually experience some range of emotions, because talking about any issues around equity oftentimes are going to be what gets associated with it are some emotional feelings. And we would say the work toward transforming anything different and toward liberating, environments is going to be emotional task as well. So anytime people are energized emotionally towards stuff that they're excited about, you have the emotions there as well. So you want those emotions in there. I think there's oftentimes what happens when things go really bad and what's my facilitative move. And that is context specific. And we actually do have an institute where we actually do start to give some frameworks and some thinking about understanding people's emotional displays. We didn't focus on that one in this particular webinar, but that is a key piece of it. One is to start with the design, and then ultimately, how do I manage then the group dynamic when things start to play out as people show up in the design? So that's a quick response.
And again, yes, this what we're offering today is really just one small piece of a 2-day institute that we offer on designing and facilitating meetings for equity that has some sections on how we manage our own emotions, how we support the emotions of others, and just kind of give space for emotions in equity work as an essential piece of that. We've got a question here about, do practical and experiential outcomes need to align, or can they be separate? Also, do you list experiential outcomes on an agenda, or is that for the facilitator? Can I jump on that one?
Yes.
So we would say there needs to be some level of alignment in the sense that whatever practical outcomes you're working towards, you want them to be doing that in a way that they're still experiencing whatever outcome you set. So we want to be sure that we're not saying you do the experiential outcome in the first part of the meeting with the affective stuff, and then you go to the conceptual practical. We want to actually think about how are they going to feel more trust or more unified or more whatever it may be as they're getting to the practical outcomes as well. They don't have to be the same thing, but they have to be aligned enough that both can happen simultaneously, say. And in terms of, do you share the experiential outcomes, that is completely context specific in my experience. That there are some groups where you actually want to be clear to say, we need to be able to get into some disagreement to get through conflict, or we need to build trust. But for some groups, especially that are newer, some of those experiential outcomes might feel a little bit like people might think that's kind of the warm and fuzzy stuff or whatever it might be, and that might actually disengage some participants. So it's really about knowing your group and saying, is this important for us all to be explicit about, or do I want to just share the practical outcomes and as a facilitator know that I'm trying to guide them through a certain kinds of experiences to build the trust or whatever it may be. All right, let's take a couple others.
Yes.
Let's see. We've got, how do you differentiate for group members at different places in terms of commitment and knowledge of equity? So that's an interesting, tough one.
You see that?
Yeah.
I was reading in the chat. I missed that.
Oh, sorry. So if I can start,
Yeah.
I think that we always assume, I mean, given our different identities and how we are situated differently in the world, we have different access to privilege and power, et cetera. Any group of people is going to come in with different lived experiences, different understandings, different conceptual knowledge from, academic readings, whatever it may be, that on some level, there always has to be some differentiation, and that we would offer as one piece that we think about, how do we create spaces where people's personal stories can come forward, and that like to be able to share some of how I see the world given who I am, and that on some level is a matter of like helping people coming at whatever level they're in to be able to share where they're at and what they think, and to know that we do want to get to the point of having some shared language. So some people may already be there, some may not. Rather than just doing a targeted group for the people who aren't there yet, we want the whole group to actually make meaning together, even if they've already been there. So I think sometimes there's just an acknowledgement that we need to do some things as a whole group and not split off to differentiate, but know that we're going to kind of have different levels of experience and maybe can call on people to offer some of the way they see things or the way they learn things in a time that other members are just trying to wrap their heads around what this means. I don't know if you want to add anything else about that.
Yeah, I think, for me, when working with a group over time, this becomes a little easier to do because partly of your work in the beginning is to really kind of do a little assess and pay attention to where people are at. And here's then the gut check is also, and then to check your assumptions about where people are at, right? So one, you do want to be paying attention to that so that you continue to adapt and figure out how to change your structures to kind of meet people where they're at. Ultimately, again, back to what Colin was saying about the stories, like how do you design for people to learn from each other too? So knowing that people are in different places, you as facilitator, quote unquote, sometimes might be the provider of some of the conceptual. How do we get the mix of like, I'm not the only one providing the content. How can I let the content and the information emerge from who's in the room and do that actually together? So partly some listening, paying attention, and sometimes we hear and see things and I do it and I have to check myself and I think, oh, because I heard this comment or this comment, well, this person's got a lot of work to do. This is where they're at in the journey, right? I don't really know that person. I'm not in their head. So, but I may have got some quick pings around, oh, okay, they make a statement like that. It makes me think this, but continue to check my assumptions. And on the commitment piece, that to me speaks to around the will. And that's another one where it's like, how do we give opportunities for people to their will to flourish and show up? That sometimes we all are holding our own lens or a stance of like, well, not, I shouldn't say a lens, but we're holding a standard of what will and commitment looks like. And when people are not doing that, then we think they're not committed. Mm-hmm. And so how do we still have that as a host and a facilitator, what commitment looks like, and continue to try and find how is this person committed versus like, I'm not seeing them do the commitment that I'd like to see them have. First starting like, they're here, they're trying to do some stuff. What does commitment and will look like for them? And start from that place. And we might see some stuff that we didn't notice before and say, they actually are committed to this, and maybe this piece that I thought they weren't committed to, it maybe they're kind of, I don't know, hiding from something that they don't know, and it's showing up as a will or commitment, but they don't want to let anybody know that, hey, I've been doing this work for 15 years, and I don't even know what those 2 or 3 concepts are that people are talking about. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to avoid the conversation or something like that. So just a quick response to that around that, differentiating, starting from a place of being curious about people, mm-hmm. letting the structures also unfold some of the knowledge and learning together.
So we should start to wrap up. Great questions here. Sorry we can't get to them all. Did want to just say, someone asked, is it possible to have all 4 learning methods in your agenda, or is that overload? Mm-hmm. And we would say, in general, whenever you're trying to actually get people to do some real learning or work together, we do want to attend in some way to all 4. As you saw in this webinar, the imaginal of think about what you want this group to do down the road took just a couple of minutes. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're doing a 45-minute session on each of the 4 domains, but you're attending to them all in some way. For those meetings that are just like technical nuts and bolts for 20 minutes, maybe you don't do all 4. But in general, when we're trying to do meaningful equity work, we want to make sure we do get there. So thank you for all of that and for all the other questions. Many of the questions are about how do you get engaged in courageous conversations, which makes me think of our coaching for equity work, or how do you handle certain facilitative moments of when things get really tense. All of that, we do definitely have stuff on. We're not going to be able to do that today, but it is a nice transition to some other opportunities.
Yeah, so a couple of ways to stay connected with us. We will still be offering more webinars in the future, but just ones that are coming up that actually take a little bit more time to go into more content. In particular, the one from today's webinar, this Design and Facilitating Meetings for Equity, will be here in Oakland in January. It's a 2-day institute where we take a deeper dive in this experiential learning cycle and a whole bunch of other stuff to consider about conditions and group dynamic, facilitative responsiveness. And so that one would be another one to consider for yourself if you want to fly in, drive in, or you're local to consider. And that one will have a huge practical component because you have, in many ways, almost like a case study when you're thinking about a particular group and applying some lenses and thinking about what they're up to and how do you design spaces for that, for that team. And more importantly, what happens when things come up? What should you be paying attention to? So we bring in neuroscience and, kind of a couple other pieces of content frameworks that help you kind of pay attention to groups. And then we also have, for those of you all, which is probably all of you who do work one-to-one with folks, we have one around coaching. And this particular one, though, is around coaching for equity with focal students in mind. So it's really geared more toward the people who take a coaching stance and work with teachers and educators that are working with young people, and how to use a focal student approach to kind of be a window and a mirror into, and as a metaphor, around your teaching and what's happening for young people, and then understanding the context they're sitting in through having some kind of empathy approaches and getting in close with kids. And as teachers, then thinking about, what do I do with what I'm learning? So it's a focal student approach that really is a professional development type of approach to learn about the impact, not just the intention of your instruction. So that's a 2-day institute. And so how do adults support other adults to use a focal student approach? And there are last 2 that we wanted to offer you to consider and try on is our Leading for Equity Institute. It's a 4-day residential engagement. We do a few here in the Bay Area in Oakland. I'm sorry, in California, and we do have one in the Chicago area. And they're over several different months. And just imagine yourself coming with minimum of 2, no more than 6, coming as a team from your context and doing another deeper dive into your leadership and your lens on equity in your context for yourself, and then doing that collectively with some people that you have come with. So you kind of name some equity challenges that you're grappling with, and we offer some content and some space to peel back layers to that and think about what your agency is around that. And lastly, we've been working with the Black Teacher Project over the last couple of years, who now formally have a more formal relationship, where it's an organization that does affinity work with Black educators. And so we have some structures and opportunities for folks to get involved in kind of affinity-based work. And by going to our website, you can hear and see a range of those activities that they have available to educators in your context if you work in education spaces. So as a reminder, again, we're going to send you a PDF of the slides. You'll have that. You'll have transcriptions of many of the questions and the chats and different things. So those are always good things to look back on and as people lifted up the ideas. But please do stay in touch. Stay connected with us. If you want to learn more about how we can partner with you, there's an email there for you to consider. But most importantly, back to some of those images, continue to stay grounded, continue to breathe, continue to lead from a place of what matters to you. We're just inspired and excited that so many of you would just take a little time off to share an hour with us sharing a little bit of our thinking.
Thank you all. We hope to see you again soon. Take care of yourselves.